All right, perfect, perfect. I hope everyone enjoyed that music. I think we still have it playing. Um, Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for this HBCU Smart Cities Town Hall 103, based on inclusive communities. Really excited for our guest tonight. We have G3 ICT Smart Cities for All, who's leading this workshop. This workshop is very close to us. A lot of the cities that we deal with really focus on this problem. So we're excited to have James Thurston and the team at G3 ICT in attendance today. So our speakers tonight will be Mr. James Thurston. He is an international technology policy leader as G3 ICT's Vice President on Global Strategy and Development. He leads the design and implementation of new worldwide advocacy strategies and programs to scale up G3 ICT's global impact. He has experience applying both technology and public policy to important social and economic challenges, ranging from promoting the inclusion and human rights of people with disabilities worldwide to using technology to increase the competitiveness of aging US industrial centers. He has broad policy and management experience in both the private and public sectors and at the federal, state, and international levels of government. Thank you, James, for joining us tonight. My name is Ayinde Simon. I'm Director of Partnerships for the HBCU Smart Cities Challenge. My role in this challenge is really connecting with cities and some of our tech partners to make sure we have proper problem statements from them, and also that our students and HBCU teams are supported throughout this challenge with great tech partners through our mentorship and coaching programs. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Mr. Thurston tonight. As I said earlier, a lot of our problem statements focus on how do we build better inclusive communities. So I think this is a conversation that really will hit home for a lot of our city partners. Okay. So the three core goals of this town hall. First, we want to identify best policy practices to enhance digital inclusion. We want to surface key examples of how leveraging emerging technology and inclusive communities can support tier 2 to tier 4 cities. And we allow attendees to discuss barriers and misconceptions of implementing inclusive technology. So those are our three goals for this town hall. I'm excited to jump in. And just to give everyone an overview of this challenge, this town hall is a part of our HBCU Smart Cities Challenge. That is a 5-month challenge for HBCU students to build a smart city application, leveraging ICT, IoT, and Web3 tools. They have to build a proof of concept and MVP from now until January. We have educational workshops every Wednesday, weekly, including these smart city town halls, which actually helps walk students through milestone development of their MVP, access to emerging technology, and mentorship with a lot of our tech partners. So just to give a quick overview of how it works, each city partners, by participating, they submit 2 problem statements that HBCU teams work on throughout these 5 months. Again, they have HBCU coaches and mentors who help students implement this technology and work towards their MVP. And we utilize what is called the borderless model with our students. What is exciting about that is typically in these hackathons or challenges, you see university versus university. What we chose to do was break down those barriers and create a borderless model. So students are able to work on their MVP based on their interests, not their geographic location. That does 2 things. One, it allows students in tier 2 to tier 4 cities access to this challenge. If there's one student at an HBCU that wants to take part in it, he can or she can, which is phenomenal. The second thing is to prepare students for remote work. So we're really excited about creating this kind of program. In the last 2-3 years, everyone has been working remotely. We say, why not teach our students that skill? So we're excited about this challenge. And again, this town hall is a part of what we're doing over these next 5 months. So with no further ado, I'll pass it on to Mr. James Thurston to talk more about G3 ICT and a lot of the great work they do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ayinde and Kevin. Thanks to the HBCU Smart City Challenge for your leadership in this space and for proactively reaching out to us in our organization to talk about inclusion from a disability perspective and accessibility in smart cities and really the work that we're doing worldwide with cities and technology companies and incubators and accelerators and others around inclusive smart cities. Yulia, if you want to bring up our slide deck, that would be great. So I'm going to be speaking with a couple colleagues today. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. But we're going to focus our remarks and our discussion with you today on the significant digital transformation of cities and how that dynamic is leaving out many people, specifically people with disabilities and older persons. And we'll ask the question, are we designing or are we creating our smart cities for everyone, including people with disabilities? And I can give you a little bit of a spoiler to that question. We're not, and we'll talk about why we're not and how we're not developing and deploying technology assets and smart solutions that work for people with disabilities, and what we can be doing as cities and as universities and as other partners to develop and deploy smart solutions that really do work for everyone in the city. But we'll get into that in detail in a few moments. Julia, if you want to go to the next slide. So we'll first do some introductions for you, and then what I'd like to do is talk through disability and urban inclusion and sort of what we're talking about. What are some key concepts and trends around inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities in cities, in urban environments. We'll talk about why accessibility of technology assets and of smart solutions really matters in cities, including the cities that you all are working with or are from. And we'll sort of finish up with a discussion of how we can be doing better collectively, collaboratively, to make sure that the technology that we're developing, buying, and deploying really does work for everyone in a city as it's becoming smarter. And then Ayinde, I think you may be leading some breakout discussions, and then we'll conclude with some questions if there are any. Julia, if you want to go to the next slide. What I'd like to do is start with just an introduction to who we are. Julia and Mohammed and I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. We're all from an international nonprofit organization called G3ICT. We were created about 16 years ago with support of the United Nations, specifically to focus on these issues of technology and the human rights and inclusion in society of people with disabilities. We do work in every region of the world, in developed economies and developing economies. And we do that work in a few different ways that are kind of depicted here on this slide that I'll just talk about really pretty briefly. We run the International Professional Society for Accessibility. So all kinds of professionals who have accessibility as part of their job, whether they're IT professionals or human resource professionals, they're members of this professional association, and it does what most professional societies do, including training and certification around different aspects of accessibility. So we run that. That's one of our units. Mohammed is with our group that does institutional relations and advocacy. A big focus there is making sure that organizations of people with disabilities are a part of these conversations and a part of the programming and work that we're doing as equal partners with government and with the technology industry. Our focus is on inclusion from this technology perspective. We have one of the biggest technology and disability conferences every year. It's actually next week here in Washington, D.C. So if you're in the neighborhood, please do come by. It's called the M-Enabling Summit. We do a version of that also in Europe every year. And then the group that I lead here at G3ICT is really focused on programs and policies specifically to promote this inclusion of people with disabilities. And so we do a lot of work with governments, civil society organizations, and industry to identify these good practices that support a way of using technology that really does enhance the inclusion of people with disabilities. And about 5 years ago, we launched a specific smart city initiative, which we'll talk a little bit about when we start getting into the work. So I'm joined today by two exceptional colleagues. Julia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, James. My name is Julia Sarviro. I am a senior project manager with G3ICT in James' team. So I work a lot with James on the policy development and support to the governments, to the city governments worldwide. My background is pretty diverse, I would say. I have PhD in public international law, but for the last almost 15 years, I work in the area of accessibility. First at UNESCO, and I was dealing with the issues of inclusive education. And then with Microsoft, dealing again with the digital inclusion issues. So I'm excited to be here today. I will stay on the background most of the time, but if there are any questions or maybe in the chat during the presentation, I will be here as well to answer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Julia. Mohammed, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone. It's very exciting to be here this evening, and thank you for your being interested in issues of smart cities and inclusion. My name is Mohammed Lutfi. I am based in New York. I'm originally from Lebanon. I'm the director of capacity building and advocacy at G3 ICT under the Division of Institutional Relations and Advocacy. And I manage G3 ICT's Digital Accessibility Right Education Academy. It's an academy that we started last year, aims at enhancing efforts and capacity of persons with disabilities and their organizations working in the field of digital accessibility through their advocacy efforts around issues of, tackling issues of digital divide and promoting inclusive ICTs around the world. We also support persons with disabilities who are interested in getting certified as accessibility experts through our International Association of Accessibility Professionals at G3 ICT. We offer them a scholarship, and we also offer them online courses, and we open up opportunities for of networking and collaboration through our global network of digital accessibility champions. My background, I come from the disability rights advocacy world. I was the executive director of this Disabled Peoples International, and I currently co-chair the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities on the SDGs Sustainable Development Goals at the United Nations, and I also co-chaired the partnership group of persons with disabilities through the UN, through the Habitat 3 General Assembly. I lived in Washington, D.C. for 12 years. I earned my PhD in anthropology at American University, and I was formerly a Fulbright scholarship. I did my master's in international development at American University as well. Sorry, this is my cat. And I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Mohammed, thanks so much, and Julia as well. We have a great team at G3 ICT. Julia and Mohammed are a couple of colleagues. So I mentioned that 5 or 6 years ago at G3 ICT, we decided that we wanted to have a program, a global initiative that really focuses on cities. In that Smart Cities for All program, and there's a website that maybe Julia can share the link to as well. We partner with all kinds of organizations to help cities understand why and how to be more accessible and inclusive as they're becoming smarter. So we partner with, the HBCU Smart Cities Challenge, the World Economic Forum, the G20 Smart City Alliance, UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, which is an association of cities, the World Bank, the UN system, and technology companies, big and small. And our approach to working with cities is really collaborative. And so we like to partner with all kinds of organizations. The reason, Julia, if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to talk through a little bit some of the trends and demographic realities that kind of inspired us to create the Smart Cities for All program that led to our work directly with cities, and that really informs and drives that work today. So we know that cities are our future. 50% of all of humanity lives in cities today, and that is going to increase to 70% by 2050. A friend and colleague of mine that works in this space often says that cities are where people live, work, and play. So much of what we do in our lives happens in cities, and increasingly that living and working and playing is supported with technology. If you want to go to the next slide on digital transformation. So we we know that the world is continuing to undergo a really dramatic, significant digital transformation. There's more mobile subscriptions today than there are human beings on the planet. More than 8 billion mobile subscriptions worldwide. 70% of youth worldwide are actively online. We have a generation of digital natives that are expecting to use technology throughout their lives and use it in a way that is very personal to them and works for them. There's 50 billion IoT devices connected to the internet that we're using all day and every day. No longer just your mobile phone and your computer, but your refrigerator, your scooter, your car, everything that we have is connected, and we're using that technology in all kinds of ways. We have a really rapidly growing mobility as a service offerings around the world. I was in a meeting with Move It, a transportation planning app where I heard them mention that they have more than 500 million users, and they support every day more than 5 billion trips of different kinds. So that we're using technology for transportation in really exciting ways. And in a lot of cities, that's sort of the leading edge from what we see and the work that we do. Their leading edge into using technology and data is around in transportation in particular. So as I mentioned, this digital transformation is happening in every region of the world, the global north, the global south, in big cities and in small cities. If you want to go to the next slide. And today, smart cities are really on the leading edge of this global digital transformation. The market for smart cities technology is enormous, likely more than $25 trillion within a few years. And what we know and what you know, probably better than most, is that these smart solutions, these technology assets, are supporting a broad range of city activities and programs and services. Every technology company out there now, every consulting firm has a smart city unit focused on cities and how they're using technology. There's lots of startups with exciting new products specifically targeting cities, and the HBCU challenge likely will be leading to more, which is exciting. And cities and their technology deployments are, I think, really in a lot of ways redefining how we as human beings are interacting with each other and with our government and with society. Again, all really exciting if done well and if done in an inclusive way. I think is one indicator of the scale of the digital transformation of cities that has really stayed with me is that not long ago, our team was doing some work with the city of Mexico City, the largest city in all of the Americas. And at that time, their IT department was managing the development of 25 new city apps every week to support all of the work that the city did across multiple departments. So an enormous amount of development activity happening, and really exciting, I think, if those apps were developed from the outset to be usable by everyone in the city. And obviously a real enormous risk, which we'll get into if they weren't designed and developed to be accessible. So if you want to go to the next slide on smart city definition. So what do we mean by smart city? There's probably as many definitions of what a smart city is as there are smart cities. But I actually like this one by the Smart City Council, that a smart city uses information and communication technologies to enhance the livability, workability, and sustainability of cities. I really like the focus on ICTs and on the human aspect of cities, the livability. I would probably add some stuff to that definition around resiliency, because we are and can be relying more and more on technology for a better response to disasters and crises of all kinds. I'd probably also be a little bit more explicit and clear about the very inclusive definition of livability, what we mean by livability, and certainly that definition of livability extends to everyone in the city, including persons with disabilities and older persons as well. So for us at G3ICT, when we're working with cities, I would say we probably let cities opt into their definition of being smart. A smart city doesn't have to be only about leading edge technology. about sensors and AI, but really for us in the work that we do with cities, if a city has a mobile app and a website and they want to call themselves a smart city, that's great. They're using technology. We just want to make sure that they're using that technology in a very inclusive way. So, Julie, if you could go to the next slide. When we talk about wanting them to develop and buy and deploy technology in an inclusive way, in an accessible way, we mean that specifically in our work for people with disabilities. And so I want to just talk a little bit about what we mean by disability, and Mohammed, in a second, I'm going to hand off to you as well for your perspective. For us in the work that we do, I think initially, or in the first instance, we look to a definition of disability that comes from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We were actually created our NGO at the same time that human rights treaty was coming into force. Just about every country in the world has signed on to that human rights treaty that really defines broadly the rights of people with disabilities and accessibility, including of technologies at the heart of that human rights treaty. But that treaty, that human rights treaty, defines disability as individuals who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments that interaction with certain barriers hinders their full participation in society on an equal basis with others. There's a range of disabilities. I think importantly, by the best estimates, which are likely quite conservative, there's more than 1 billion people in the world with a disability, or about 15% of the population worldwide or in your city. And also importantly, I think, is that 70% of disabilities are not noticeable. You're not going to know someone has a disability just by looking at them. A lot of the work that we do with cities and other organizations is we often hear, well, you know, we don't have anyone with a disability that works here for our city, or but again, you're not necessarily going to, one, that's impossible, but two, you're not going to know if someone has a disability just by looking at them for the most part. I think also importantly, that another statistic on that slide is particularly important for entrepreneurs and developers thinking about new smart city solutions. People with disabilities and their close family members have a disposable income of more than $8 trillion US. And so there's a way to be also thinking about that as a market segment that is as large as China in terms of 1 billion people and with a lot of disposable income. And so some of the companies, the leading companies, I think really take that into account too as they think about developing new products. Mohammed, anything you'd like to add about definition of disability or your work with the disability community worldwide?
Yes, James. Thank you. Well, again, as James started, it's very important that we start with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that was adopted by the United Nations in the year 2006 in December. And if we notice that the definition about disability in the convention is not comprehensive, because the idea behind this definition is that the convention aimed at leaving the option to countries to also establish their own definitions, especially that the definition of disability or the perspective about disability is not static. It improves over time due to progress in science and technology. If we notice also the Americans with Disabilities Act gives a rather comprehensive definition about disability. And the good thing about ADA is that it also offers the perspective on the diverse aspect of disability. Persons with disabilities are not one group. Given the types of disability, traditionally there are known types of disabilities like blind, deaf, physical disability, persons with intellectual disabilities, and over time, more disabilities became more either independent or discovered, such as James said, there's at least 70% of persons with disabilities who have invisible disability, related to psychosocial disabilities, bipolar, epilepsy, and so on and so forth. Now, we have to keep in mind also that 80% of persons with disabilities population lives in the global south, and they are also 80% of them live under the line of poverty around the world. Just to also very quickly say that theoretically speaking, interaction with issues of disabilities developed over time. Traditionally, it was perceived as a matter of charity, thinking that persons with disabilities cannot be contributors to society, and rather they need to be pitied and benefit from charity work. Second model is a medical model on disability, where people used to think that disability is a matter of illness, this caused also some sort of isolation of persons with disabilities, because persons with disabilities had to be confined to rehabilitation centers and not to be offered opportunities to be contributors to society. And as a result of this model, the reaction of the disability movement led to creating what we call today the social model that we see emphasized through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where the issue of disability is not in the person himself or herself themselves, but rather in society, where we see more challenges related to lacking of accessibility in the built environment and access to information or technology. And this is why we are here today to talk about how to tackle these challenges, particularly on the digital accessibility part.
Great. Thank you, Mohammed, for that. And really, the really important point of that shift from a medical model definition of disability to a social model in a more rights-based model. I think that shift from there's something inherently wrong with the person, the medical model that needs to be fixed, to a more social and rights-based model that recognizes that we are creating the disability by the way that we're designing our society, including our cities, including our technology. We're creating those barriers. We're not creating societies and cities and technologies and smart solutions that really are designed to work for a range of abilities that every human being has. And as Mohammed mentioned, as the chair of our board, who's considered to be the father of this human rights treaty for people with disabilities, often says that disability is the one group, the one minority group that everyone on the planet will become a part of if you live long enough. You will acquire disability if for no other reason as you age, as we all age, we pick up some kind of age-related impairment that affects how we move through society, affects how we use technology. So Yulia, if you go to the next slide, and Mohammed really started to get at some of these issues, which are critical. I talked about some statistics like there's 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people in the world with a disability, 15% of the population. But I think some of these disability and outcome statistics are even more important certainly for the work that we do and the work that we do with cities and how cities should be thinking about.
That you worry about failing?
Excuse me? Some of these other statistics should be equally important as we think about how we're creating smart cities. So we know, for example, that people with disabilities are less likely to start school, they're less likely to finish school, they're more likely to be unemployed or underemployed. People with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty, as Mohammed was saying. And again, that's doesn't matter what country, the global north and the global south, it's the same in every country. People with disabilities are less likely to be part of the financial services system, which exacerbates poverty. And they're more likely to never be online, and so not benefiting from a lot of the digital transformation that's going on in society and in our cities. And so these kinds of socioeconomic outcomes that are related to disability are, I think, important drivers for the work that we do with cities to make sure that the technology assets they're deploying, the smart solutions they're deploying really are inclusive in supporting the rights and inclusion of people with disabilities. Mohammed, anything else you want to add on sort of outcomes and disability?
Yes, I would like to also add that the lack of accessibility has caused, as James said, persons with disabilities to lack opportunities to inclusive education. That doesn't mean that education didn't exist for persons with disabilities. Historically, education started with segregating institutions that benefited from the charity model and the medical model earlier. But thanks to the technology, opportunities of inclusion has increased or have increased for persons with disabilities, and also the employability of persons with disabilities has increased for persons with disabilities because of technology. Yet the statistics on disability and employment or education still show us that there is still work to be done for ensuring persons with disabilities to have opportunities in education, employment, and also technology has benefited persons with disabilities to enjoy further rights that have been reflected through the convention, such as access to transportation, culture, independence, freedom of expression, mobility, political participation, and also, due to this progress or development in the perspective on disability, we talk now about data. We talk about data, meaning collecting data about disability, and also enabling persons with disabilities to have access to data through technology and digital platforms. So, yeah, that's what I would like to add. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. Yulia, if you want to go to the next slide. So as Mohammed was describing, technology brings a lot of opportunity to support greater inclusion and rights of people with disabilities in cities and countries and around the world. But we know from the work that we do in the partners that we work with in industry and governments and civil society organizations that today technology is not yet living up to the full promise of really being a tool for greater inclusion, because technology is not accessible enough today. Yulia, if you want to go to the next slide. So what we mean by, in the work that we do, by technology not being accessible enough or smart solutions not being accessible enough is a few things. Most fundamentally, I think that there are definitions specifically of accessibility in different standards and treaties and laws. But for us in the work that we do, I would say technology that is accessible is technology that really does work for everyone, that it benefits everyone, not just some groups. We also know, importantly, that accessible technology is defined today by really robust global standards. These are technical standards for technology that define for every kind of technology and every kind of disability what is accessible. These standards, there's three of them that we point to in some of the tools that we have. And Yulia, maybe you can put the toolkit link up in the chat. There's three in the work that we do with ID departments with cities that we focus on that are available. They were developed over years. They're robust, testable standards for technology and for accessibility of technology. And then going back to Mohammed's points, the other way that we think about accessible technology is really that it really is a civil right and a human right, and defined in laws and regulations in many countries around the world. Mohammed, before we go on to accessibility and inclusion in cities specifically, anything you want to add about accessible technology?
Yes, just very quickly, we have to see, and maybe we'll come across this later in the presentation, that even though technology, it still needs to have more progress to become more accessible and available for persons with disabilities. We have experienced increased interest over the last 3 years. I mean, pandemic had downsides, but also had like positive sides or outcomes on especially on this level of digital accessibility, where technology companies have realized, and also people like employers, schools have realized how important it is to offer digital accessibility, not only for persons with disabilities, but also for the general public as well. So because as especially elderly people, as James said, so This is, and just would like to add, and also the standards that James mentioned, like the European standards or ISO standards, international standards as organization, and even here the FCC 508 FCC Act are like the three main things that all work in harmony with each other, because given the global scope of technology, these standards have to be harmonized. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you, Mohammed. Julia, if you want to go to the next slide. So accessibility and inclusion really does matter in our cities, particularly as our cities are developing, purchasing, and deploying more and more technology and smart solutions. And so if you think about cities and you think about all the incredibly important services and activities of cities, services that cities offer. I live in Washington, D.C. And use my city services every day. Increasingly, those services are supported with or even delivered through technology, which as someone coming out of the technology industry, I love that. It's very exciting, but it presents both opportunity and real risk if that digital transformation of my city's services or of your city's services is not accessible and inclusive for people with disabilities. And let's just give maybe a few examples to make it a bit more real and tangible. So cities are deploying technology to support transportation and mobility. Trip planning apps, allowing us to coordinate how we get across city, across different modes of transportation in the city, plan those trips from, subways to scooters to Ubers, and shared services. These apps and mobilities rely on enormous data, schedules and maps, and they present that information. But that information density may not be accessible to people with cognitive disabilities, or those maps and schedules and graphics may not be accessible to people with visual disabilities if they can't be read by a screen reader. And there's ways to make sure that those apps are designed to work for people with disabilities. Even the apps themselves, the button placement in the apps can either support people with mobility disabilities using the app or present a barrier. In the transportation space, if you think about kiosks and sort of self-service terminals for ticketing, the placement of the screen and the keyboard on the kiosks can either allow for a person in a wheelchair to easily use that kiosk or present a real barrier. Likewise, if it's just a touch screen, that can present real barriers to someone with a visual disability if there's no way for audio output, secure and private audio output. And again, all of this is sort of defined in these accessibility standards. And so as people are developing solutions, whether they're in existing companies or new solutions coming out of incubators and accelerators, they can be thinking about and designing them to be accessible using these standards that we mentioned. Cities are also using technology increasingly to support and deliver their social services, critical social services that cities provide and that governments provide. Early on in the pandemic, when a lot of people in the US in other countries were losing their jobs, a think tank here, a technology think tank here in the US did an assessment of websites for unemployment benefits and found that more than a third of them were not accessible to people with disabilities who really had a critical need for those support services for unemployment. In Chicago, a primary and relatively easy way that you can apply for public housing support is online. But again, if that online service to get that kind of support is not accessible, then people who really need that critical service, that critical support for housing, have a real barrier to get those services. So you can see in some of these areas like social services, digital payments, even citizen engagement with increasing numbers of digital 311 systems to report problems with streetlights and potholes. We see lots of cities rolling those out. We see some cities developing those from the outset to be accessible. The city of Chicago did that really well a few years ago. In other cities, investing in digital 311 systems, either developing them or purchasing them, but they're not accessible, and then having to figure out what to do to retrofit them, which is way more expensive than thinking about accessibility up front as a city in your technology systems. Likewise, we see cultural institutions, museums using technology more and more, courts and justice systems. The pandemic really accelerated the digital transformation of courts really around the world. And we see a lot of courts going paperless. Again, that can be really exciting and create some efficiencies and certainly sustainability benefits and environmental benefits. But if those records, if those documents are not accessible and be able to be read by someone with a cognitive disability or a visual disability, then it's an enormous barrier to people with disabilities to have equal access to critical information in the courts and justice systems. So really all of these areas that cities are very active in, they're using technology, and probably today, and we'll talk about this in a minute, not thinking enough about accessibility of their smart solutions, of their digital solutions that they're using to support their services. Mohammed, before I go on, anything you want to add about kind of the barriers in some of these solutions that people with disabilities might face?
Sure. Well, thank you, James. I mean, you gave a very comprehensive perspective about accessibility in smart cities, but I'd like to emphasize the very important outcome of making accessibility available or adopted by cities is one very important aspect in lives of persons with disabilities, which is ensuring their independence and safety. I mean, now I can rely on my phone, go from point A to point B without depending on others to help me cross the street or find a location or so this makes me enjoy being touring the city or going from one place to another. Also on the consumptional level, purchasing tickets, train tickets or bus tickets, or checking the schedule of the metro or the bus. These are very important that have transformed lives of persons with disabilities, making it more easy and independent and safe, especially like when we talk about courts and interaction with the city authorities. If I have any issues, any problems, any security issue, I can reach out and check the website of my court here or my police department and request services. So before the adoption of accessibility standards through these services, I had to rely a lot on other people to help me with this, and that would have delayed or hindered my chances of independence and safety. And I would like just to also say that, and perhaps we will talk about this later as well, which is that all this work is thanks to the existence of laws and also efforts of local organizations of persons with disabilities who've been working really effortlessly to make sure that these standards are adopted by their cities. And we can talk more about this later. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. And we can talk more about the legal frameworks, both here in the U.S. and globally. One of the things that we know from the work that we do at G3ICT, we do a sort of an analysis every, and actually Mohammed is intimately involved in this, an analysis every other year of what kind of progress countries, in this case, are making on technology and inclusion and accessibility in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And governments are pretty good at adopting policies and much less good at implementing those policies. And so there's always work to be done in making sure that and advocating for progress in implementing the existing policies and regulations and standards that we have in place. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So as we were launching our Smart Cities, inclusive Smart Cities program called Smart Cities for All 5 or 6 years ago, we actually started with a global study. We did some roundtables in smart cities around the world. We did a survey of more than 250 people, experts around the world. And what we found was that today, smart cities, and again, think of that as cities that are using technology and data, they're actually making the digital divide worse, not better, for people with disabilities. It's an unfortunate reality that we created the program to try to fix and to change. So from the experts that we surveyed around the world, we heard that 44% of them, only 44% of them knew of a smart city that had any focus at all on the accessibility of technology. Just 18% of these experts around the world knew of a smart city that was using these very robust global ICT accessibility standards. And more than half, 60%, thought smart cities are failing people with disabilities. So not a great picture in terms of the current state at that point of how well cities are doing at being both smart and inclusive. And then Yulia, if you go to the next slide, maybe even more directly on point or relevant for the HBCU Smart City Challenge. As part of that global study, we also actually surveyed residents or entrepreneurs, developers in incubators and accelerators around the world. Again, several hundred of them. And the data coming out of that survey as well was equally unfortunate, I guess I would say, in that there was not a lot of focus in these accelerators and incubators that are creating the next great solution for cities or for society, the next great technology solution. Very little thought about accessibility and inclusion. And so what we found is that in many ways, the incubators, the accelerators, the innovation ecosystems, including in cities around the world, were actually likely making that divide, that digital divide for people with disabilities, worse, not better as well, and sort of setting us even further back. And so in that survey of entrepreneurs in actual accelerators and incubators around the world, we found that just 38% of these entrepreneurs, these people in the incubators, had a strong understanding of accessibility and inclusion in their own product design. I actually think that number is probably higher than real, but even at 38%, not a large number of these developers and entrepreneurs understood accessibility for their own product that they were developing. Fully half of the entrepreneurs in the incubators that we surveyed were not sure if people with disabilities could use their solutions that they were developing. And nearly all of the entrepreneurs, the residents of the incubators and accelerators, 90% of them said that some tools, some training, some improved knowledge about accessibility and inclusion were definitely needed by them within the innovation ecosystem. And so as we're developing new solutions, as we're doing challenges, it's important to be thinking about accessibility and inclusion as part of that. So if you can go to the next slide, which is kind of approaching the end of our formal remarks here, we can definitely be doing better. And as I mentioned, we created this cities program to help cities do better. And we have a few things that we want to share in terms of some specifics of how we can be doing better. And at G3ICT and through our Smart Cities program, we actually have created a maturity model assessment tool that looks at 27 different variables on how cities are using technology and data and whether or not that's contributing to inclusion of people with disabilities or creating barriers. And we developed this assessment tool, this maturity model tool, over a few years. We've been using it with cities around the world. And from the use of that tool to do assessments of cities, there's a lot of great learnings, but we can certainly point to, I think, some good practices that cities should be thinking about as they're using data, as they're using technology, as they're becoming smarter. And so I want to maybe just share some of those with you. And Mohammed, I'll sort of check in with you after and see if you want to add anything. But certainly one of the things that we see in our work with cities one of the good practices that we see that really leads to cities being more accessible and inclusive is involving users, including users with disabilities, older users, and involving those users really at every step of the process of developing, buying, deploying your technology solutions, your smart solutions, including in the testing, actual user testing by people with disabilities, and the user needs definition as well for if you're developing or procuring a technology system. Another good practice is procurement itself. We really see this as critically important for all kinds of organizations, but certainly for cities. There's a pretty long and extensive global track record of how procurement, how governments, how cities buy technology can really either promote accessibility and inclusion or inhibit it. In fact, we're partnering with the World Economic Forum and with the G20 Smart City Alliance, with UCLG, to help cities make sure that the technology they are buying, and cities buy a lot of technology, or pay for the development of a lot of technology. But we're working with these cities to adopt a model policy for procurement that says we will only buy technology or invest in technology that we know is accessible to these global standards. So we've done work with Los Angeles. We're currently working with Istanbul and Quito, Ecuador. We just are announcing 2 new cities that we'll be working with on this. And the reason we focus on procurement is because we know it works. The US federal government has had a requirement on itself to only buy accessible technology for some time. Lots of other countries do. Increasingly, cities do as well. I call procurement the sort of low-hanging fruit of accessibility policy because it's relatively easy to do and really impactful. It's basically the city saying that our investments in technology, what we deploy, will be accessible both for our citizens and visitors, but also for our employees with disabilities. So that's a real important good practice that can help us do better in being inclusive and smart at the same time. The third is use these global standards. There are 3 key ones that we point to for ICT accessibility. They're in our toolkit. They're in 12 languages, 11 or 12 languages, that tool. But standards are the building blocks of technology and of innovation, and certainly can play a critical role in making sure that investments in technology by cities are accessible. Some really good cities we've seen, like Chicago, they reference these ICT accessibility standards in their design guides. Their design guides for their own internal IT department, IT professionals, their own developers, but also for their vendors as well. And really think about elevating these accessibility standards to the same level that a city would focus on privacy standards or security standards. Accessibility should really be at that same level in terms of the standards being a commitment to those standards. Another good practice that I think can help cities do better is think about the data divide. We've talked a lot about a digital divide, but there's a parallel sort of data divide, data being the lifeblood of smart cities. People with disabilities are a data desert. They're not contributing into these key data sets that cities are using to define programs, make policy decisions, and they need to be a part of those data sets, but they're not. And so think about ways to close that data divide and make sure that the data sets that cities are using to drive their smart programs are really reflective of the entire community, including people with disabilities. Leverage tools. There's a lot of shareware and free tools that are already out there. We've mentioned some of ours, but there's lots of others. A lot of these problems around technology and accessibility and inclusion in cities have been thought about and solved. It's just a matter of cities getting connected up with those solutions and with those tools. And so be aware and make sure that you're leveraging those really good existing tools. And then finally, the last good practice for making progress that I'll point to is really robust partnerships. I think the most successful cities that we've worked with, that we've seen, that we've evaluated, are doing exceptional jobs partnering with disability organizations, with other civil society organizations, with their vendor ecosystem, having those kinds of partnerships to really make sure that the city is focused on in the right way, accessibility and inclusion, and making progress, including through those partnerships. So Yulia, if you want to go to well, actually, before we go to the last slide, Mohammed, anything else on some of these good practices and suggestions for cities to do better on accessibility and inclusion?
Sure. I'd like to emphasize the role of organizations of persons with disabilities as a source of data regarding the needs and the situation of persons with disabilities in the city. As James rightly said, that persons with disabilities are often excluded from decision making by local authorities and by governments in general. So this is what we emphasize as a practice, that those who are in charge of smart cities to take into consideration the inclusion of persons with disabilities, because they are the experts on their needs, they are the experts on what is available in terms of options and technologies around for making the city more inclusive. The other thing is, in terms of standards, it's very important to use the standards to leverage infrastructure, not only in terms of what services there are, but also infrastructure for enabling persons with disabilities to use and benefit from smart services offered through smart cities. And here I'm referring to two things. Number one, enabling persons with disabilities to have affordable access to technology through local authorities' subsidies programs, such as what we call the Global Service, Public Global Service Fund, and also ensuring that companies that offer or partner with local governments or authorities or administration to adopt standards of accessibility, not only in terms of offering an accessible technology, but also to to ensure the sustainability of this technology through IT support system and also maintenance. Infrastructure is very important for enabling persons with disabilities to have access to technology. And one last thing I would like to add is there are lots. G3ICT can offer lots of sources of knowledge on technology and accessibility in general. We are about to finish the updating of our comprehensive digital policy toolkit, digital policy model toolkit, which covers all areas of accessible technology and ICT, digital accessibility in general, and it has hyperlinks that lead to also external sources on the subject matter. So we invite you, once it's ready, you will be informed about it, and you can use it and promote it in your network, through your network. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. If you go to the next slide, just to as we end, we always like to challenge cities to focus on not just being smarter, but being smarter and more inclusive. They go well together. The last slide, which is our resources, we'll just sort of throw this up. And I mentioned tools and partnerships. If you go to our G3ICT website or our Smart Cities for All website, there's lots of resources there. Lots of descriptions of the kind of work that we do with cities and otherwise around accessibility and inclusion. Ayinde, I think that's all we have for formal presentation. Happy to discuss or hand it off to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that presentation, James, and thank you, Mohammed, for chiming in and just walking us through that guide. I mean, really robust, really comprehensive. I know it's a lot to digest. And it's probably sparked a lot of questions. I think instead of going out to our breakout rooms, what we'll do is just do Q&A now. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. You can be unmuted, or you can put it in the chat. Really excited just to kind of dig in. I know for me, I just have an initial question as I think about our challenge and our students. I I think more about the tools and frameworks that help guide entrepreneurs. I love that slide we say we need to do or we can do better, involving city participants. I look at that as customer discovery. The first thing an entrepreneur does is think about who is your customer, but we don't always see that parallel. So I'm really curious, are there other guides specifically for entrepreneurs who are looking to develop smart city solutions, and how they can be guided to make sure they're building inclusive solutions for the cities or just whatever product they may be building?
Sure, there's lots of great resources on accessibility of technology at all levels of sort of technical depth, I would say. The W3C, which has created the web accessibility and increasingly even mobile accessibility standards, has really good resources for very technical people. Our professional society does as well. And so I'd point you to the W3C and to our professional society. Yulia, I don't know if you shared the link to the professional society, but that would be good. Also for the incubators and accelerators in the innovation ecosystem, we've actually created an inclusive innovation guide, not so much for entrepreneurs and developers themselves, but for the ecosystem that nurtures them and invests in them and supports them. And what are the steps that those incubators and accelerators can be taking to help developers, help entrepreneurs think more about disability in older persons as part of those user needs, as part of that community they want to serve with whatever their new product and service is. And there's in that inclusive innovation guide, there's things like ways that incubators can do a better job of bringing in people with disabilities as mentors as part of their programming, or and so I'd encourage you to, anyone involved with that innovation ecosystem, to check out that innovation guide as well.
Perfect. And I know you shared a few links. All those links will be sent out as resources with this recording. So if you miss anything in the chat, we make sure we'll get that from G3 ICT and send that out to everyone. I know Robert has a question, and then we'll get to Aaron Lindsay in the chat. So Robert, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey guys, this question is for Mr. Thurston. Thanks for sharing everything with us. My question is, you mentioned earlier in this segment that you have experience with different cities and different apps and such with mobile technology. So with that being said, what are some of the key factors or sticking points that you have seen collectively with so many cities and apps that kind of foreshadows, or rather tells whether or not this app will really work and generate a lot of use compared to apps that may seem like they're promising but ultimately bottom out? Is there anything that you could speak to in regards to that?
Sure. Well, a couple of things, and I'll come at this from the perspective of accessibility and inclusion and technology solutions, smart solutions that work for people with disabilities. First, and Mohammed, you should chime in on all of this as well. I guess we've chosen to focus our work in cities and on technology for cities more on mainstream solutions and making sure that those work for people with disabilities, and less on new solutions that work specifically for someone with a cognitive disability, or only for people with cognitive disabilities or visual disabilities. Not exclusively, but we think we reach more people with our small team by making sure that mainstream technology deployments are accessible to everyone. And so we do a lot of work focused there. In that space, we can certainly point to solutions that have been developed that are good from an accessibility perspective and that are not. In fact, one of the first questions I get asked by CIOs of cities is, James, I get why the technology we use should be accessible to people with disabilities. Just tell me which one to buy, which we don't do. We're a nonprofit. And I can tell you, Yulia and I typically go to the big Smart City Expo in Barcelona every year, walk the floor of all of the great solutions, hundreds of them on the expo floor. 4 or 5 years ago, the first time we went there, I found two solutions that were accessible out of hundreds. It got better in later years, but it's still nowhere near large numbers of these mainstream solutions being actually accessible for people with disabilities. And I talked about the digital 311 systems that lots of cities are deploying. The one in Chicago, they were very mindful about making sure it was accessible in their user needs. For that solution, they involved people with disabilities in the testing when it was, after it was developed and was being deployed, they involved people with disabilities, and it actually became an award-winning digital 311 system. Conversely, at around the same time, actually, we were doing work with a major city in Mexico, also a great smart city, deploying a digital 311 system, but developing it. Actually, they developed their own, but with no thought to accessibility, and so have had to likely go back and completely retrofit it, which is expensive. I mentioned that we focus a lot on mainstream technology solutions and making sure that they work for people with disabilities, that they're accessible. That being said, we have seen and have partnered with organizations on some solutions specifically for people with disabilities. And we partnered with the University of Washington to work with 5 cities in the Americas on using data streams and AI and machine learning to develop an app. They developed the app, we helped them deploy it in these cities, that solves the number one problem I hear from cities and from disability commissioners in cities around the world, which is has nothing to do with technology, but that our sidewalks are completely inaccessible. Every city has thousands of miles of sidewalk. Sidewalks are key to all kinds of activities and outcomes for everyone, including people with disabilities, but oftentimes they're impassable for people with disabilities. And so what this app does, this one is designed specifically for people with disabilities, is it uses these different data streams and accurately describes the accessibility of these thousands of miles of sidewalk in the city, including things like the slope of the sidewalk, are there potholes, what's the sidewalk made of, is it dirt, is it asphalt, is it concrete, all really important bits of information that allow a person with a disability to find the most accessible personal route from point A to point B. So there's sort of two ways that we look at technology and solutions around disability: accessible mainstream solutions, but also targeted solutions to solve these longstanding inclusion challenges in cities for people with disabilities. Mohammed, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you, James. We work according to the concept of what we call universal design. Universal design is when we encouraging authorities and governments and companies and whatnot to take into consideration the concept of accessibility and inclusion from the first step they start when they start planning for their projects and programs. By ensuring that standards of accessibility and inclusions are taken into account from day one through any operation cycle. First of all, you ensure that everybody is included. Second, you save a lot of money. It's less costly to start planning for inclusion and accessibility throughout all mainstream programs, services, and projects from day one, instead of remembering later on and do something retrospective, which is very costly. Yet I agree that with James that we have to also keep in mind that there are, in addition to universal design standards that can be beneficial for everybody, regardless of their needs and situation, there is a standalone technology for persons with disabilities. For example, I use a JAWS screen reader, to navigate through my computer and read my text and run email and do surf the internet. Of course, we don't expect that everybody would use that. However, I mean, that can be beneficial for a lot of people, especially that when we talk about people who develop disability throughout time, because disability can be temporary and also can be something that people develop throughout time because of age and other circumstances. So this is what I like to have.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for that question, Robert. That was a great question. We'll get to Ryan Taylor. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And then Aaron Lindsay, you can drop your question in the chat.
Thanks so much, James and team, for this really riveting information share and knowledge share. There's a lot of neurons firing. I have a lot of thoughts and ideas, but I'll try to scope it down to one question. Just quick introduction. I'm an investor in the catalytic capital space, and I'm really curious as to how you all see. I like your Ayinde, your reference to sort of customer discovery and what this means for early stage startups. I'd like to get your perspective on what color or flavor of capital makes the most sense for these kind of interventions. My home domain and sector is climate and energy, and I have a lot of thoughts about how early stage finance can be catalytic in getting companies off the ground and getting them into spaces where they're making a lot of impact. But I'm curious how you all see investability in this space and what's required.
You know, Ryan, I'll speak for myself, and Mohammed and Julia as well. If you have any thoughts, that's great. I'm not sure. We don't get too actively involved in that phase of technology. Certainly not in the investment, and really not too deeply into the development either. We're more sort of focused on policy and how governments around the world and at different levels are working to develop technology. That being said, in this inclusive innovation guide, one of the things that we do point to in the work that we did around the world is just like the innovation ecosystem needs more people with disabilities defining needs and mentoring developers. It would be great to have more people in the investment side be people with disabilities as well, because they bring that perspective and that nuance to investment decisions as well. But in terms of, I don't have the expertise in investment vehicles and so I'm not sure I can answer the question in the way that you're looking.
Maybe an unfair question to ask.
It's a great question, but I can't give it justice. Mohammed, sure, jump in.
Yeah, sorry. I think one way to think about it, instead of identifying sources of capital, like how to invest in, is also to think of strategies to encourage companies to invest more in digital accessibility. I know several countries that have incorporated sort of like incentives in their laws to encourage companies to, first of all, make sure that persons with disabilities are included in their programs, and also invest in inclusion and accessibility. Of course, this has to be accompanied with sort of like effective monitoring system to make sure that people are not manipulating laws to just showing on paper that they are doing what they are supposed to do. Other things is we encourage governments to invest in this, because governments are, I think, one of the main sources of capital for investment in smart cities, and local authorities as well, making sure that there is effective budgeting for accessibility and inclusion by local authorities and governments. The other thing is we tend to use the argument that accessibility and inclusion are beneficial for investors, because by making sure that persons with disabilities have access to services and products, this is a good source of income. Imagine now you are adding 1 billion people around the world who would be able to have access to purchasing products using accessible websites, or become employable, and thus increasing their income and consumption capacity. This way, I mean, you can convince investors to put more money into accessibility and inclusion. Just instead of always identifying alternative sources, it's a good thing to think strategically.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful, Mohammed. It reminds me of some of the work that we're doing to hold other investors responsible and accountable for just a broad set of diversity metrics in terms of what we're aiming for. And it is understated, and maybe it should be overstated that accessibility should be a part of that. So thank you.
And Ryan, I think the other thing I would add is part of the conversation that we have with all kinds of organizations, including companies, but I think would be of interest in the investment community as well is if you think about accessibility as part of universal design, and as if you design something that's going to be accessible, it's going to be more usable and a better product for everyone. I myself do not identify as a person with a disability, but if you see me using my mobile phone, I only ever use speech recognition. I don't type because I have big hands and typing is not a good experience for me. But that's an accessibility feature that makes that product more usable and more personalizable by everyone. In technology, really, a few years ago, the speech recognition wasn't at the point where I wanted to use it. It just wasn't accurate enough. But because of AI and machine learning, it actually is pretty accurate now, to the point where, again, you'll never see me typing on my phone. I only use speech recognition.
I just wanted to add here that James almost has stolen my argument.
Sorry.
Yeah, but it is something that we see that there are a lot of features that were initially created for persons with disabilities, but they are used widely by the general population just because it is so comfortable for anybody. And it works for built environment, but it also works for the digital world, even better than for built environment. Also, James pointed out the power of public procurement. And in many countries, we see that the fact that the governments start to include those requirements for accessibility for all the technology solutions that they purchase, that brings the additional leverage for the companies why to start doing that. Because before that, many companies were like, why would we do that? We only have maybe 2 customers who are persons with disabilities. We can live without those 2 customers. But it's not true. There are not just 2 of them. And also, we see that persons with disabilities are very loyal customers. If they find the solution that works for them, they will stick to this solution, to this brand, to this company. And the same will work for their household, for their families and friends, because very often those solutions are bought for the family use, for example, and they will definitely choose something that is available and accessible for all of them. So there are a few arguments that can be used for investors to pay attention to that, and probably not specifically for making solutions accessible or accessibility solutions, but for universal design, for creating solutions that are accessible for everybody.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you all.
Wow, thank you. And that was a great question, Ryan. I think something that we talk about a lot with our company is we think about how do you communicate the double bottom line. I think is what everyone is expressing is how do we communicate that to investors in a way that gets them excited, also shows the fiscal performance, but also the responsibility and impact they can have when they choose to invest and use these guidelines. That's a great question. That's something that we constantly think about as well. We have one more question from Aaron. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. This is such a great conversation. So I used to work in civil and human rights policy, and I know that nothing moves people to adoption like either a carrot or a stick. And so on the carrot side, I think seeing success in other cities helps, motivate others to follow suit. So I guess my question is there a standard bearer city when you all are doing this work? Is there a city that you're thinking to yourselves, man, I wish everyone could be more like X, right? What is a great model city that has adopted these policies and kind of been a leader in inclusion and accessibility? And then part 2 is then what made that possible, right? In that city, was there a particularly strong activist community? Was it greater resources and investment? Was it, a strong or a particularly empowered disability commissioner? Kind of what were the criteria that made that success possible?
Really great question. And I think you've probably hinted at the answer in many ways in the question, which is great. So we often get asked, what is the most accessible, inclusive, smart city or city out there? And there is no city is doing everything great when it comes to accessibility and inclusion. A lot of cities are doing much better. If I'm pushed, the city that I probably point to as being, from an accessibility and inclusion perspective, the most advanced, I would probably point to Tel Aviv in Israel, part of the startup nation. But I think a lot of their progress has been driven both by policy and regulation. It's a requirement in different areas. But also, I think within that very robust startup ecosystem, a real focus and recognition on universal design and accessibility that's sort of built into the DNA of the ecosystem there of startups. And so that's helped as well. And a very strong disability advocacy community as well. In other places, certainly here in the US, you know, a lot of the larger cities, I would say, are actually pretty good. And Aaron, to your point, they actually will typically have a disability commissioner. I think that makes a lot in this country. It makes has had a lot of impact on driving progress in some of the larger cities on inclusion, because that's a political appointee typically. A lot of the more medium-sized cities will have an ADA coordinator. ADA coordinators are often focused more on built environment, not so much on technology, or not as comfortable with technology, and they certainly don't bring the same level of political power that a commissioner would have. And so not to say that some of the mid-range cities aren't doing well as well. A lot of them have good practices. But the experience that we've seen with some of the larger cities, I think the disability community with the disability commissioner, and then some, obviously in the US, there's already the ADA and other laws in place. That's really helped drive progress. We just finished working earlier this year with Los Angeles to adopt this procurement policy. Governments in the US buy 40% of all the technology purchased, so it's really important for them to say accessibility matters to us. LA has we just worked with them to adopt the model policy for accessibility and procurement. I think part of the driver there, and we see this around the world, Aaron, is cities getting a lot more focus on this issue of accessibility if they're about to host the Olympics or the World Cup. There's lots of reasons for that. I think going back to, I think it was the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, where the city was sued because the Olympic website wasn't accessible. And so subsequent cities have really had and typically the Olympics come with the Paralympics as well. So there's this focus on inclusion that's built into the Olympic experience. But we certainly see Olympic cities and World Cup cities being, World Cup countries being increasingly focused on accessibility for a bunch of reasons.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add here that US actually differs from many other countries in a good way, because the community of persons with disabilities is so strong here. And the laws are favorable for persons with disabilities in the sense that it is quite a litigious society, right? And it is quite easy to go to the court if something is done wrong, and if some rights of the persons with disabilities are violated. Unfortunately, it's not the case in many other countries, but this, in the US, this is something that can be used, the power of the community, the power of the persons with disabilities themselves.
Absolutely.
Thank you for adding that point, Yulia. And I know for our challenges, we think about smaller cities. It's great to hear what is happening in larger areas and see how that can be replicated in some of the tier 2 to tier 4 cities. So it's really exciting to hear a place like LA adopting these things, because we feel like there's great room for experimentation in the southern region and smaller areas. And how can we take what's happening in those cities and bring them to smaller cities? So it's really exciting to kind of hear the development, the work you all have done.
Yeah, I absolutely think you can bring any of the tools in our toolkit, including the procurement policy, work just as well in medium and smaller size cities.
Perfect, beautiful. Well, listen, I know we can probably talk about this for another hour. I'm so excited we got a chance to really dig in and ask these questions. Thank you so much, James Thurston, for leading this presentation. Thank you to Yulia, Mohammed. We really appreciate you all just giving us a robust walkthrough of what inclusive communities looks like. I think for our partners and for our tech partners and city partners, we know this is very beneficial. So I want to say thank you so much just for taking the time, and thank you to everyone who asked phenomenal questions. I think we all learned a lot. This recording will be going out. I know I'll be re-listening and picking up some more tips to add and help cities. But this was very great. So thank you all for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. So just a showcase for our next event next week. I'm sorry, that date is correct. It's October 27th, I believe. But we'll be doing a Smart City Town Hall based on Smart City Networks. We're working with the Helium Foundation and Cloudflare. This will be sent out to everyone in this call. You'll get an invitation. Really excited about that conversation next week. How do we use Smart City Networks to help build communities and build products in these communities? So look out for that from us. Thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions, thoughts, feel free to reach out to us. Any cities that would like to be involved, any of our tech partners, feel free to reach out to us directly. But until next week, thank you so much for joining us.